Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's exclusive event. My name is Simon Hunter, and I'm going to be your host for the next hour. Let me start by thanking our sponsors, M2M Connectivity and Libelium, for making this webinar possible. M2M provide IoT expertise and technology that helps power industries, improve lives, and paves the way for the next generation of wireless innovation. Libelium designs and manufactures wireless sensor network devices for systems integrators, engineering, and consultancy companies to deliver cutting-edge, reliable Internet of Things. Today, we're going to be shining a light on the future of agriculture and the role of technology in helping to increase agricultural efficiency. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the role of IoT technology. And we're doing this in the context of the opportunities and challenges facing the agricultural sector right now, which at the one end of the spectrum include finding ways of increasing productivity with greater environmental constraints. And at the other end, working out how to capitalize on the rise of new technologies like 5G. A great statistic that I read yesterday from a recent McKinsey report states that agricultural connectivity could unlock more than $500 billion in GDP by 2030. And hopefully today gives you some insights into how we might do that. So to help us tackle this topic, we have four experts who are joining us today. They include Alicia Acin, who is CEO and co-founder of Spanish IT company Libelium; Paul Stapleton, who is the Director of Precision Livestock Farming. He's based in Emerald, Central Queensland; Patrick Eckel, who is the CEO of Melbourne-based technology consultancy DigIo, which is part of the Mantle Group; and Simai Akinci, who is an IoT Solutions engineer at M2M Connectivity, and specializes in helping M2M customers design and integrate leading IoT systems. So if we just move on to the agenda, our agenda is divided into 5 parts. First, we're going to take a look at global trends with Alicia. Second, we'll focus on the opportunities and challenges in Australia with Paul. Thirdly, we'll walk through a case study with Patrick, which will focus on an IoT implementation at a vineyard in the Yarra Valley. And finally, Simai will take us through a more detailed look at the nuts and bolts of implementing and integrating IoT devices and systems. And at the end, we're going to bring everybody back together for a Q&A with the entire panel. We really want this to be an interactive session, so please submit questions throughout, and I'll try and ask them on your behalf. And we want this to be an interactive session, so submit questions as we go. You can do this by looking at the right of your screen. You'll see a side panel with 2 tabs. Submit questions at any stage, and only the presenters can see them. We're also going to be running a few surveys throughout the session, so please, you'll be alerted to those. They'll pop up, so please engage with those. And actually, that's the first thing we're going to do. We're just going to kick off with our first survey. So you should see that pop up any second. And then I will invite our first panelist. So let's kick off. I'll ask Alicia Acin, CEO and co-founder of Libelium, to please join the stage.
Hi. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Simon, for the introduction. It's a big pleasure to me to be here with you all in this webinar organized with our friends of M2M Connectivity. And it's an honor to be opening and setting the framework, the general framework for the discussion. We are here to talk about AgTech and about what all the technologies available today can do for making a small farming and small agriculture. We could summarize and make big list of benefits in smart farming, but we could basically group all of them in 3 major groups. The first one would be to increase both quality and quantity of the production, whatever we are producing. The second one would be to increase our sustainability, because when we are reducing the amount of fertilizers or water resources for irrigation. We are making a production not only more efficient from a cost perspective, but also more sustainable for the planet. The last one would be the social part, helping with repopulation rural areas. We are facing the same challenges in all countries at different levels, but same problems everywhere, of people living their rural areas in favor of cities, looking for a better way of life, and for salaries, for better salaries. In many cases, that's totally related to the efficiency and the competitiveness of the agri and farming business that we can enhance by using better technology. So the objectives and key drivers for starting adopting ag tech in our fields could be named as product safety, increase the overall company productivity and competitiveness, increase the production quality, and of course, what we were talking about, sustainability, not only by reducing the amount of optimizing the use of scarce resources as water, but also to reduce the amount of pesticides and fertilizers that can pollute the wastewaters, and also saving the cost of the waste productions. So, for example, and I'm not only talking about agriculture, but also smart farming in a more general scope. We've seen case studies and success stories all over the world. For example, applied in meat factories that want to be more sustainable, but reusing the wastewater in irrigation, but keeping safe the groundwater nitrate levels as well, and monitoring the creeks water quality. I totally monitor at all times. And we've also seen how can you the very, very clear examples of fish farms that are increasing their productivity and income directly just by reducing the amount of losses because of preventable diseases in the animals. So the applications here, I've named a couple of them. We can go over the list, and I'm sure that if we ask each of the participants right now, we could even get even more of this list. But I don't want to steal much of the time of the discussion. What I think it's the most important thing is, if this is so amazing and so great, what's holding us back to see this kind of technologies more generally adopted in the industry? So I think that we have 4 main barriers right now. First of all, it's the problem of going from pilots and proof of concepts to real deployments. I totally understand that there is a gap between a pilot and a real project, but you cannot see how the dynamics and the numbers of a real project you are already there, which is very challenging, and especially in our experience in this kind of industry. And that's because of the second barrier, and we've seen that there is maybe a bigger technical gap between the farmers, the end users of this technology, and the technology. So we need to overcome the barrier and cross that gap between innovation and adoption. And And you need resources for that, not only economical resources to invest in the technology, but also to be able to manage the project. And you also need the support and assistance. And I always say this, when you see a big stock listed company announcing their digital transformation plans, they always name a big person for leading that transformation. In these rural areas, in this kind of exploitations, we don't usually have a chief digital transformation officer, right? So it's not only about the money, it's also about the skills. And also, sometimes the countries, the states are helping with the investment, but in many cases, they think that the only problem in agriculture it's connectivity. Well, that's absolutely necessary, but that's not sufficient. So, in conclusion, what would be the recipe to get the most of the smart agriculture and smart farming technologies would be first, try to promote at all levels this the adoption and going and this and crossing this gap of going from the technology, innovation and testing to the real deployments. Secondly, if governments are considering about subsidizing and supporting the 5G and the connectivity infrastructures as necessary, consider sensors as well. And I'm not talking about the desire. I'm talking about things that are doing other countries that are considering national networks of sensors. Of course, it means balancing between the funding between innovation and adoption.
Alicia,
And
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I've just joined the stage, and I'm just in the interest of keeping us on track. I think you're raising some really fascinating points. But just so we don't miss out on tapping into your expertise in this section, all of these barriers to adoption that you're mentioning, are there examples, because you've got a great global perspective, are there examples in Europe of things that are happening over there that aren't maybe happening in Australia that are working to help the industry, farmers overcome those barriers to adoption that you could share with us?
Well, right now, we have in the European Union a big plan for allocating funds for the European recovery after the COVID-19, and the European Union is trying to address this as a whole, and understanding that it's not only about considering the connectivity as the only problem for farmers to adopt this kind of technologies. And it means the project is very ambitious. It's not already deployed, but it's an idea. And if successful, something definitely to copy, to cover everything from the sensors and communication infrastructure to also the training support to the farmers to know what can they really get from this technology, and also to be able to do this project management task to adopt them and integrate the technology in their daily processes. Okay,
great. Thanks, Alicia. And just one more question we've had from the audience just while you've been talking. And I'm not sure how you'd answer this, but we may come back to it later in the panel if other people want to reflect on it. Do you consider the cost of moving product to market as significant?
Yes, I think that's one of the challenges, and very often you see that the producers are making less money than the supply chain, and that's one of the reasons why vertical farming is becoming a so much attractive option. We've seen that vertical farming it's meaning a new whole perspective to producers. And for example, right now in the south of Spain, there's a producer of strawberries that used to depend on the supply chain to make the products arrive in Madrid. And now they are building their own vertical farming in the surroundings of Madrid. And the reason of doing that huge investment that can be between 3 to 5 million euros is exactly reducing the transport cost. So definitely, yes.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alicia. I think that's a great point to end on. We'll talk to you again during the panel discussion. So I'd now like to invite our next speaker to give a slightly different perspective, and that's Paul Stapleton, who is the Director of Precision Livestock Farming, and he's going to give his boots on the ground perspective from his office in Emerald, Central Queensland. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you very much, Simon, and everyone, thank you. As you mentioned, PLF is based in, and just waiting for our slides to come on.
Oh, there we go. Excellent. They're up.
Okay, got him. Okay, so as Simon mentioned, PLF is based in Emerald in Central Queensland. For our international guests, it's located on the Tropic of Capricorn, about 270 kilometres inland from the east coast. Our client base consists of livestock, primarily beef cattle with some sheep and goats, and cropping, both irrigated and dry land. I've been asked to talk about our experience at PLF, and one of the key experiences that we have is that farmers are not really driven by ag tech. They're driven by ag business, or we used to call it agribusiness. Across the board, farmers tend to be conservative. In relation to ag tech, they really don't know what they don't know. It's a bit of a pun, I know, but there's a general distrust of strangers, particularly someone trying to sell them something. And they tend to look for two things: someone who's generally interested in helping them to solve their problems, and somebody capable of delivering that. And having a business champion, an industry leader, is absolutely imperative. I'm just jumping around here a bit. Okay, so our approach has been to focus on that ag business and to demonstrate ag tech as the enabler. The components of that: utilisation of limited resources that they have in our properties, looking at how IoT can reduce the time, human resource cost to get information together and do the inspections that they need to do out on their properties. The accuracy of information and timely access, that they can get data fully automated to them without them having to do inputs, and of course that reduces the human error issue, and that the data can be accessed 24/7 on any device. The benefit then to ag business is that the saving of that costly time in monitoring all those things that they need to do in operations: water, soil, livestock, etc. It allows the resources to be reallocated and redirected to areas that can actually have an impact on revenue. The end result of that being improved productivity and leading to increased profitability. The challenges that we've had, I guess the first one was getting to the truth of device capabilities. In Australia is very different to many other parts of the world. We have extreme environments. For instance, at the moment, our temperature is about 35 degrees Celsius. A week ago, it was over 40 degrees. That's between 95 and 105 degrees Fahrenheit. We're just coming out of a long trend of drought. Our travel time in our region alone, a typical travel time would be 2 to 3 hours each way. And I have clients that are 5 and 8 hours each way consecutively. We talk here about boots on the ground, and boots on the ground is really the only way to gain acceptance within that farming community. It's by sitting down at their kitchen table and talking about what their issues and problems are that we can best find solutions using IoT sensor-based technology. An example of that just last week at a client with 3 properties. One of those, this is cattle properties. One of them was quite distant. It had no power. There was nobody living on site, but they had cattle there, and only a couple of devices. So instead of going to a typical LoRa situation, LoRa gateway with a solar kit, for only those couple of devices, it worked out better to go to a satellite gateway. We have, just quickly, all farmers look at water as being their core area of survival. Obviously, water flow from their dams, etc. And then when we start moving then into livestock, the level of water in their tanks becomes very, very important. Where we have started to see some real benefits have been in on-farm weather stations. To have many of our clients can be hundreds of kilometres away from a Bureau of Meteorology site, and so to have local and accurate weather is really important. And the company that we use to do our forecasting produces timelines out to over 2 weeks. And an excellent example of that was early this year, we had a weather system coming in. We knew about it 2.5 weeks in advance. The Bureau of Meteorology only gave us four days of notice, but the property, it enabled us to move cattle from one side of a very large creek back onto the main body of the property, so we could maintain management over the herd, which we wouldn't have been able to do if we hadn't had that notice. Just a very recent thing has been a location and safety of devices, and a situation occurred only a month ago where one of our clients' wives was actually trapped under a device. They didn't know where she was. It took them an hour and a half to find out where she was, and until they found her, they couldn't get the emergency services to her. Had our device been on that device, one, it would have told them that an incident had occurred, shown them where the device was, so they could have gone straight to it, and at the same time they could have sent the emergency services directly to that location. So we're seeing this growing from customer requirements and customer requests. Just in finishing, we've tended to be non-proprietary in relation to how what we offer our clients. It gives us a range of options to suit our client needs. There are no two properties are the same. And it also allows for our ongoing development that we do continuously with M2M connectivity to enable us to bring best of breed to our clients. That's basically where we're at. Where, as I say, it's boots on the ground. It's getting in front of the client, having that conversation, and then working out what can be done to meet their particular needs.
Thanks, Paul. That's fascinating. A real contrast to what Alicia's talking about with those, I guess, global challenges. A lot of them are universal, but actually getting onto farms is probably something a lot of us don't do very much of. So very rugged environments, and as you described. We got a question from the audience, which is about that. So it's about performance and reliability of devices. So the question is, how do you deal with extreme temperature on the devices? And does that affect life expectancy, for example?
That has been one of the testing things that we've been doing with M2M connectivity over the last 2 or 3 years. We have moved to a group of sensors that have been able to, as we say, cut the mustard. We did change our water meters from a blue version to a red version that can hold much higher temperatures. But certainly, when we look at devices that we're going to use, their capability of sustaining extremes of weather, be it temperature, dust, water, is very, very important. But we've been very lucky or successful in being able to utilise the right devices.
Fantastic. Thank you, Paul. Thank you for your time. We'll probably move on to the next part of our presentation. You'll have just seen the second poll pop up, so have a look at that when you've got time. So before I introduce our next speaker, who is Patrick Eckel, who is the CEO of DigIo, we're going to take a look at a quick video case study.
So it's not often you can talk about two of your passions. So for me, it's technology and also winemaking and viticulture. So for me, running a technology company, I'm always looking for opportunities where we can use our skill sets to actively support passions that people have within our businesses. And the first one for us is Vinot. So if you look at winemaking, it's one of those industries where it's not homogenous. It's not like other farming industries. You can pay $300 for a tonne of fruit or $30,000. The yields year in, year out can vary greatly, which has a great economic impact for both the people producing and making wine and also those consumers who'll be purchasing it. People have been looking at vineyard sites for hundreds of years, trying to recreate those sites of France and Italy in places like Australia. They'll dig up the soil, they'll look at long-range forecasts, but they're not necessarily taking advantage of the technology that now exists at scale to be able to create insights that might provide incremental benefits to how people grow and produce their wine. What it really is a physical device that can capture relevant information from a physical location. Here, we're in the Yarra Valley in Chirnside Park. We can capture that information, we can then derive meaning from it. So what I love about IoT is you can solve really simple or increasingly complex problems that intermix physical and digital worlds, which is something that we don't always get to do. So Vinot as a product can do a number of different things. So we can capture the rainfall data, we can capture the wind speed, wind direction, the humidity, the air pressure. We can simulate or understand the soil moisture at multiple different levels, as well as simulate what leaf wetness will be. So these are all independent data points that go into both observing a growing season, but also being able to start to make predictions on what things we should be doing in the vineyard to either increase yield or increase quality. So what we've started to see in recent years with...
Oh, we had two Patricks then for a second. Excellent. Well, welcome to the stage, Patrick. Patrick's the CEO of DigIo, based in Melbourne. I guess, Patrick, that's given us a quick glimpse as to the fact that you implemented this solution, I think, in the Yarra Valley, in Victoria. Just give us some idea of, how's that going? What are some of the results and outcomes?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with a little bit around the timing of why we actually looked at Vinot as a product a little over 18 months ago. And then I can talk about some of the outcomes we're starting to see from it as well. So we really thought there was an opportunity to take advantage of connected devices. So it's something that we've been talking about since around 2010. But what we found was there's some really great improvements in, I suppose, 4 different areas that really drove our investment and adoption of the technology for this use case. So first it was hardware, and I'll talk in a moment around the smart agricultural device that we leveraged from Libelium. From a networking perspective, there's a lot of different options that we could choose that were fit for purpose for the use cases that we've been looking at. And for us, part of our core business is building great software. So I understand cloud platforms really well and how to create really good digital experiences for people to engage with technology. So it was a perfect time to start to bring what was as I said, the physical into digital, but to create what is an augmented experience that someone will find valuable, that's not just about the sensor data. It's about the other things that people might observe. And most importantly, some of the predictions that you can begin to make, which importantly are built over time with a substantial data set. So kind of, if I talk about the hardware, so the Libelium device, and I know there was a question around the hardened nature. One of the barriers to entry when we looked at this a few years ago was the hobbyist nature of some of the IoT devices. So the ability to have something that's resilient, the ability to have something that is certified to a certain standard, made it a lot easier for us to look at the physical devices that we're going to deploy out in vineyards. So it was kind of a fundamental part of it. It also took a lot of that complexity away, where there were standard ways of getting the data in and out of those devices. When we looked at it from a networking perspective, so I won't lie, if we could use narrowband IoT everywhere, we'd be incredibly happy. But given the nature of vineyards and often in quite undulating places, and large vineyards can be in the middle of nowhere, we went down a LoRaWAN path, given that would give us the greatest level of connectivity. And in Australia, with things like NBN, we assumed that there'll always be a point where you can get some data up at some point as well. And then after that, it was really about getting that data into cloud platforms. And so for us, we use Amazon. Each of the major cloud platforms have an IoT service, which really almost creates that digital twin of what you've got in a vineyard in our case, and that digital representation that we can use. And then outside of that, it was really about trying to create an experience that was simple. So if I look at the outcomes for a user, simplicity was the key. So there's a lot of different data points that we're capturing, but the key is, what does it actually mean? So if I've got soil moisture levels at two different points, when should I actually irrigate? So it's looking at the data that we get, looking at BOM models to actually drive decision making. Even really simple things around looking at frost warnings, given there's some preventative things people can do. So comparing a long range forecast with actual data to decide whether or not someone's got to get up and turn a pump off for frost protection or burn some hay bales. So what we've started to see is start simple. So what are the things that could make someone's life easier from a prediction perspective? And we've continued to build out over time the models that could be a lot more descriptive. Probably the one thing I would say is the sensor devices are only part of what the solution is. So having every 5 minutes capturing data from a vineyard, it's even as important to capture other observations. So at what date was bud burst in a vineyard? When we had fruit set, what was the percentage fruit set that we observed? At what point did veraison start, which is when the berries start to change colour? Because all of those things can then be equated back to the real-time data from a weather perspective that we've seen. So we're only really starting to scratch the surface based on the data we've captured as to what will that mean. So the end goal is we can use that data and observations to make decisions. And that for me is really where the power of IoT, it's part of a solution, not just the solution in its own right.
So Patrick, there's obviously well, I'm guessing there's been a lot of trial and error. Getting things into, technology into an outdoor environment has always got its own challenges. Some of them you probably don't even think about until you actually start deploying things in the field. What would you say would be the key sort of do's and don'ts, reflecting on what you've been through over the last 18 months?
Yeah, there's a couple of things, and I'll start more around just the physical nature of IoT. And I think a couple of the other presenters have talked about that, where, especially in Australia, you've got a huge geography that you're trying to deploy across, and you've got varying levels of acumen to actually put that physical device out there. So we spent a fair bit of time understanding what an onboarding flow could look like. So if someone received the Vinot sensor in the post, what do? So how do they actually tell us which block it's in? How do they tell us where it is without them having to log into a bunch of different consoles that they just won't understand? So that was kind of that first point. Also, in terms of the selection of hardware and network. So again, all we're trying to do is abstract away complexity. So those choices were quite important. For us, really around having a Libelium device meant there was a low barrier of entry, and it could be repeated at scale. From a networking perspective, what was the choice we could take that would have the path of least resistance as we scaled? And then, as most people are aware, using cloud technologies, that's what you get for free out of the box. So I was trying to consider, what is a solution that won't just be bespoke for a single vineyard? What's something that we don't have to rebuild every time we do it? Outside of that, I suppose it's that whole, how do you move from it works to it scales? I suppose unit costs are something else that's really important. And I think Paul talked about trust, and for those involved in any farming pursuit, there's really tough years, and spending money on a technology device that doesn't have a solid ROI. So making sure we get a feedback loop for what works and what doesn't, and continually over time looking at ways to lower that unit cost, which is something we've actually seen even over the last 18 months. It'll be interesting from some of the other panel participants as to whether they see cost being something that will continue to decrease over time. The final one that I think is most important for me is we just need to make sure we use IoT as part of a solution. But there's often other parts of the toolkit that can be leveraged to create a really great experience for someone that's using it, that often will look at digital technology to do it.
Great. Thanks, Patrick. We've got a question from the audience, technical question. Did you establish an open source LoRa network or use an established server like TTN or Laureate?
Yeah, we actually use the Things network. And again, for the use cases that we were looking at, it made a lot of sense to use the Things network. So it was basically providing the sensor device information. The overhead of standing up our own LoRa server didn't necessarily make sense. And from a security requirement, in terms of, I can't actually remember which encryption we used, but there wasn't a need for us to move further. So that might be a consideration at a point in time, but we use the Things network. But to that point as well, as NB-IoT rolls out further, I think we would like to take the LoRa component out of our solution, because we can effectively go data from a physical device straight into our cloud platform. So when Simon asked about what some of the challenges are, you've got this thing physically sitting there connected to the internet with another server associated with it. So it's all about how do you take out as many moving parts as possible.
Fantastic, Patrick. Thank you for your time. We'll see you again in the panel session.
Pleasure.
I'd like to invite our next speaker, who is Simai Akinci, who is an IoT Solutions engineer at M2M Connectivity. And we're going to look a little bit more closely at the challenges and opportunities when it comes to actually integrating and creating IoT systems.
Thank you, Simon, and hello, everyone. So I'll try and cover some key points of consideration when working on smart agriculture projects. Our first point is around connectivity. So as everybody else mentioned, selecting the right connectivity technology can be a challenge in a country like Australia, where it's so large and remote. Locally, with IoT in agriculture, we're seeing an adoption of low power wide area networks, also known as LPWAN. For cellular options, these include LTE-M and NB-IoT, and non-cellular options include LoRaWAN. So I won't go into the technical details of each technology, but it's important to recognize that they all have their advantages and disadvantages. And what we really need to focus on is defining what the end goal is and what the task that we're trying to do is. So we really need to define two things. What is it that we're trying to do or monitor, and the type of application it is. So what I mean by that, defining things like, is it a real-time application such as continuous weather monitoring? Is it periodic, where you're only measuring the soil moisture once every hour? Or is it something event-driven like irrigation pump control? So these two things are quite important at the start of the project. I think it's also important to recognize that the solutions we end up with might end up incorporating a mix of technologies. So, and this really depends on the task, the location, the coverage, and the cost associated. I recently worked on a project where we had some devices talking over the cellular network. We had a LoRaWAN network deployed, which was then backhauled over satellite. So I think it's really important to let your circumstances dictate your connectivity technology and not the other way around. Our second point is around reliability. So for IoT solutions to have the desired efficiency outcomes, I think all the components that make up the solution need to work. So this includes hardware, loggers, sensors, SIM cards, power, coverage, software, everything. So if any of these points fail, your solution will either fail or will be impacted. And reliability really depends on all the moving bits, pieces working seamlessly. This is why we really need to have a holistic approach to reliability. I think it's really important to do extensive testing in the lab with solutions. It doesn't really matter if you're replicating the same system 30 times throughout your farm. You really need to test each and every single component before rolling out. It's also really important to stress test systems before doing an installation. So looking at things like, how does my device behave if I lose signal, or what happens if I'm only on 5% battery? So overall, it's really important to get reliability right, and that just comes from testing everything thoroughly prior to installation. I recently worked with a farmer, like Paul mentioned, he'd driven 6 hours before having put the SIM card in the device, and when he got there, nothing was working, and it turned out that he had deactivated his SIM cards 2 months before. Now, that's an easy fix, and we were able to troubleshoot that quite quickly, but if you don't do the testing beforehand, it can just mean you've wasted a whole day. So technology shouldn't upset farmers, it should be helping them ultimately. Our third point is around power requirements of solutions. With agriculture applications, we should be making careful and conservative power calculations, as mains power is mostly unavailable. We really need to define how frequently we're going to be monitoring the parameters that we are actually measuring. And this is because the power requirements of sensors can actually vary widely. So for example, when you've got let's say a temperature sensor that only consumes a few microamps, you can very well have a weather station that can consume hundreds of milliamps. And what that translates to in real life is the difference between, having an internal battery plus a solar panel plus a backup battery versus operating a device in the field for 5 to 10 years with just internal battery. Of course, as frequency of data transmission increases, so too does power consumption. But with technologies like NB-IoT, I think this is becoming less of a concern, and we really need to keep in mind the sensor power requirements around solutions. And my last point is around long-term maintenance. So Alicia mentioned that, going from pilot to real life scaled priming solutions, we're going to have long periods of time where these solutions are out in the field for 3 to 5 years. So systems need to be built to be able to cope with that sort of device management and long-term maintenance requirements, and being able to support farmers throughout that period. It's really important to also factor in things like sensors have lifespans and recalibration requirements. So for agriculture IoT solutions to succeed, we really need to do the planning at the start of the project prior to going ahead with anything. And that's probably it from my end.
Thanks, Simai. Thank you. That's a really useful advice. We have had a couple of questions come through.
Yep.
And one is about products. And I guess you've been talking a lot about reliability, of products, given the challenges of operating in the field. This audience member has actually asked which products are becoming the most popular, and he's mentioned a few brands: Honeywell, Panasonic, TB, Samsung, Zebra. I'm sure Libelium's in the mix there. Are you seeing trends towards certain products for agriculture?
Well, every application is different, and I think it's difficult to just say, this brand sensor is really good for X, because you're really looking at monitoring different things on a farm and building that IoT ecosystem. And I think one of the advantages Libelium has would be that for even agriculture, they have 2 different product models, where one is smart agriculture and the other is smart agriculture extreme. So you've got really a wide range of sensors integrated into the same platform to be able to, meet different agriculture needs.
Sure. Okay. Look, one thing that's been in the back of my mind, because it's a hot topic at the moment, and I just thought before we move on to our panel discussion, just sort of ask you about 5G in terms of, where's that in terms of adoption and, in the market at the moment? What are you seeing with clients? What are you experiencing?
Yeah, so with 5G, I think when we look at it from an agriculture perspective, we can really split it into two major categories. So there's the traditional cellular, which is, your calls, SMS, and data intended for phones and other high throughput devices, which will all be part of 5G. But then you've got the second category of 5G, which is more focused on machine to machine. And this has three advantages over traditional cellular, where we've got lower power consumption, wide coverage, and greater penetration when it comes to buildings. This, of course, comes with a trade-off of having lower data throughput. And with this side, we actually have this integrated into the current 4G, and this will be carried over and expanded in 5G. So in terms of advice, basically just make sure if you've got a cellular solution, make sure that it supports Cat-M1 and B1 connectivity to future-proof what's coming with 5G, and you'll have a system in place for 10 to 15 years.
Great, thank you. And thank you for your presentation. I'm now going to invite the rest of the panel to rejoin the stage, and we're going to get into a broader Q&A. So if there are questions that you haven't asked, please ask them, because this is the opportunity to really tap into some more in-depth advice and expertise. Just as we get started, just from the panel's perspective, for your background, we've been running a couple of polls and surveys, and a couple of things that are coming out of those. The question around, when considering the benefits of IoT, what value proposition resonates most? And what we're getting back is better customer experience, very low, 4%. But right at the top 1 and 2, improved operational insight, number 1 at 30%, and number 2, cost savings. So maybe money is not a surprise because it drives a lot of decision making. But I just thought it'd be interesting for the panel to maybe reflect on the priorities that the audience are giving those different things. So that's improved operational insight, cost savings versus things like better customer experience, which are very, very lowly rated. I might ask Alicia for her reflections. So I think we might have just lost Alicia. So Paul, I might throw it to you. What does that sound? What are your reflections hearing that?
Well, from my perspective, better customer experience and improve operational insight is probably two parts of the same answer. From a farmer's point of view, their experience is all about what it can do in their operations. It's all about give me the information I need to help me do what I do better. So I would think that it's probably just a perception of the question more than anything else. But certainly that improved operational insight is everything. It's the whole ball game as far as my clients are concerned. Cost saving, look, they will ask price, but the opportunity to save, when you look at what costs they're saving against what costs for the deployment of an IoT solution is just it's a non-question.
And can I just add to Paul's point there? I think I might have a good example for that where improved operational insight actually means a lot. I recently worked on a project where we were able to provide a device for a hay baling solution when it was out in the field doing its thing throughout the night, and the farmer was only alerted as to when the right conditions were met to wake up and do their job. So at that point, it's not so much about cost savings, but actually improving, the lifestyle of the farmer and providing that scientific evidence straight from the field.
Yep. Exception reporting is really one of the major benefits coming out of notifications of, I only need to deal with something that's going wrong. I don't need to worry if everything is green. Go on to something else that's income producing.
Great, thank you. So just as a host, you sometimes have to ask difficult questions, and whilst we are promoting M2M connectivity in Libelium today, be good to reflect on, what happens when things aren't perfect. So what have you seen fail, and what have you learned from in your experiences?
The other thing I'll add is there's a lot of moving parts. So if you think about things in isolation, you think about a hardware device, that's one component. You talk about a network that you've created yourself, that's another component. Then you're worried about all the things that sit on top of that to be able to provide an experience. So I think for me, the biggest thing is understanding how all those parts work together well, which are the most fragile or brittle, and how resilient does each component need to be. And an example of that would be, if you don't get your hardware deployment right, if you haven't got the network set up properly, as Paul said, you're going for another 2-hour trip out to fix it up. If you haven't got your software right, you can make change to it. And so I think and Sime touched on it as well when she talked about testing in the lab. Once you've got that physical device out there doing something, your regret costs get pretty high. So work out where you need to be very specific and work out where you can have a higher rate of change.
And part of that is a conversation, a bit of education with the farmer. I had one a little while back where we had put a water flow meter on a downstream from a reservoir, and we were getting some, and it was in a little enclosure, and we were getting quite intermittent data from it. It was quite strange. Anyway, when I went out and inspected it, which by the way was 2.5 hours, what I found was that they put a metal door on this little enclosure. So all of a sudden, our small sensor device or our logger was locked inside a metal container, and therefore it wasn't getting a very true reading. We're getting a SNR quite significant. so some of the things are device, and some are farmer unknowing what the limitations of the devices are, or how they need to deal with those devices.
Reading between the lines, it seems like where the industry is at the moment is it's sort of, let's buy a device to solve a problem. And maybe there's a shift starting to happen, which is people are starting to think about solutions as a whole, which hopefully would ultimately provide more benefit, higher yields, etc. From your experience, is that the transition you see happening, or are there still those barriers to adoption that Alicia referenced earlier?
I don't want to hold news. I think once the conversation has been had, the rate of adoption is very quick. And again, if you come back to the starting point is asking the farmer what their wants and needs are, what information they require. It's quite typical for me to receive an A4 page of bullet points of I'd like to do this and this and this and this, and it's a matter of saying, okay, these points here we can do immediately. These ones here, look, we'll do a little bit of investigation. We might have to go back out on the property and have a look at it. But if you can get to that stage, then all of a sudden you're in a partnership operation with that client. It's a very sticky relationship, and one that's going to proceed for a long time, and obviously likely lead into a lot of referrals.
Yeah, maybe the one other thing as well is one of the beautiful things about IoT can solve a specific problem simply. So the example of water level meters in a trough, for example. So not having to drive 10 kilometres each day to check whether a trough is full of water for cattle. That use case can have a huge impact, but it's a sensor device with an alert. And so there's not that many things when we think about the complexity we've created with technology that can do things so simply that have a big impact. So it's almost, I really like how Paul described it. Here's the stuff we can do straight away that gives you benefit, and here's the ones that we'll work through. And so, my hope is over time, those more complex solutions, like said Simon, become more commoditized, which means they're easier to access, which would be a good outcome for everyone.
Thanks, Patrick. I'll just check. I think Alicia may have rejoined us because we do have a specific question for Alicia. Are you there, Alicia?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect.
We can. So I've got a question from the audience, which is, with the advent of 5G, are you looking to add SD-RAN and slicing into your product roadmap?
Well, we are not. We are considering to integrate 5G when the technology is mature enough, but we will integrate module into our devices. So we are not implementing services on top of the connectivity. So I don't think that's happening in the very short term. We don't consider that 5G is the solution to remove agricultural barriers, but for sure that's something that we will consider in a future roadmap, but not in the soonest term.
Okay. And Alicia, while I've got you, we're talking a lot about the problems that farmers are trying to solve at the moment. Water being, a definite focus, and people using sensors and systems to look at that and monitor that and gain insight. But where do you think the technology is going to take us maybe in 5 years' time? What do you sort of foresee as some of the big technology changes that are about to happen?
Well, I think that definitely the usability of the technology will evolve a lot, and I mean that when I was talking about crossing the gap between innovation and using disruptive technology to massive IoT adoption, I think that we need to see technology without realizing that we are having sensors on the field. We are at the moment of collecting data, but we are not still really exploiting the data. So what we are in a level of saving water in irrigation in your wineries, but we are not massively using machine learning and artificial intelligence to design the kind of wine that you want to produce. And I think that's going to be the most disruptive thing.
Yeah, so thanks, Alicia. From your perspective, you see the reality of how easy and difficult it is to create systems, and you read about the promises of technology in the future, whether it's satellite or AI. What do you think the most realistic picture of what's about to happen is?
I think what it will come down to for farmers is being able to collect real-time data from their farms and using that to really save time. Maybe not cost initially to begin with, but really save time in a very short period of time, but also understand, I think, long-term climate, how the climate is changing over time and what they need to plan for. That's where I see it being currently at. I think edge computing has some way to go. We first need to, like Alicia said, build that infrastructure of sensors before we can move on to that step.
Yeah, maybe I'll add to that. We've almost got innovation coming from both angles. So when Alicia was talking about kind of the AI and machine learning part of the world, we're now starting to see large Q1 organizations using their vast amounts of data to create what is the next best action for a customer in whatever field they're in. And so their maturity is they're just doing those programs of work now. And so if you kind of go from a bottom up, how are we leveraging sensor devices to get data? And then we've almost got a top down. So we're seeing kind of two different sides of the market starting to come together. And I think also to that point as well, the complexity can come in is how do you capture and store that data? How do you actually get it into a format that you can drive meaning from it? And so it kind of takes it more from digital and physical into almost an engineering task. You've got hardware and electrical into some really cool software and data engineering. So that whole ecosystem actually starts to become a little bit complex to create what is a really simple solution. So, but also there's a lot of tools, for example, that are becoming a lot more mature in the cloud space, both for capturing data and doing meaningful things with it. So hopefully that'll also help the adoption, because you have to do less yourself, whereas historically there's a lot of things that you'd have to build yourself for it as well.
Thanks, Patrick. I think there are incredible opportunities out there for agriculture, and obviously some challenges which we've touched on today. That's actually going to conclude our event for today. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you to our panelists for your time. Thank you to the audience for your questions. M2M will be in touch after the webinar, and we hope this is the start of a conversation which will help you on your IoT journey. Thanks again.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.